Hi, everybody. So we are live today again, and I'm super excited for today's topic. I feel like when you're changing careers, and I think when you get into UX design, you're always wondering, like, what is the different roles that you can take as a UX designer? And me coming from a boot camp, usually you don't get, of course, in 3 months, it's not that you can see and learn much of all of them. So at one point, you just like fly to every single role, and they're not really definitions until you start getting into jobs or start talking to people and you realize there are more roles and they have different responsibilities, different skills. So for today, we are going to talk about UX architect. And for that, we have Donnie. So instead of me talking about him, why don't we bring him in and he can tell us about? Hi, Donnie. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me over here.
Yeah, nice to have you. I know that before this, we were talking about you being in the East Coast and enjoying the rain, while here on the West, we're enjoying the sun. Uh, I mean, we could talk about weather for all day long, but why don't we tell people about who you are? Yeah, tell us about you.
Sure. So I am a design system architect, which has to do with UX clearly. Uh, and much of my responsibility there is to maintain and otherwise a plan for the design system at GoDaddy, where I work full time. Prior to that, I used to work at Compass, also maintaining and planning for their design system, where I also built out their design system team over there. And past that, I also teach at Parsons School of Design here in New York, courses on user research and interaction design. So very busy.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I know that when I met you, I told you I love Parson and I always wanted to study in Parson, New York. So, really exciting. I love this question and I think I repeat the same speech every time. But I always found interesting the fun fact about people. So, what is something fun or interesting, unique about you?
Okay. I had my 15 minutes of fame playing Dance Dance Revolution. I was actually very, very good at the game. So much so that I was internationally recognized. I'm like in a magazine. I was featured on TV. I'm
Wow.
in a music video playing it. That was a good portion of my 20s. I no longer play like that. I try to play every once in a while to keep the exercise going. But yeah, there's definitely videos of me online you could find very easily of me playing and being a part of that community. So that was cool.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay, so I feel like a lot of people is going to start Googling you just for that. I think a lot of questions maybe you will get is like, how do you become a UX architect? Like, how someone gets there. And I know that you have um, a good story about this because it goes even beyond when we knew about like UX design. So, how did you become a UX architect?
Yeah, admittedly, the TLDR of it is I kind of given myself that title just because of the things that I've done or the things that I want to do. So, and that's something that's pretty common in the industry in terms of identifying what title you should be giving yourself based on the work that you either are doing or will be doing. But my background, going about way back, in many years when I was a child, really was talking about, really how to interact with the stuff that I was creating. I mean, I was of course into Legos as a child and things like that, but that grew up into a lot more where I really wanted to build things that people would interact with. Wasn't enough for me to just draw something and have that as our piece, but I really wanted people to walk around something that I made and even touch it and feel it and have it respond to that stuff. So that was a really important like identifying part of me that I knew if of course later on if I get something that as a career that would actually support that, that would be amazing. But I never really thought of that as a career at the time. I just thought it was something that was resonated with the thing that I really like to do the most, or what I got a lot of feedback about. But eventually, I was introduced to the web through some friends about making a website and stuff, and that was just absolutely eye-opening. Where now I can build things that are interactable for very low resources, just one computer that could be touched by everyone in the world, hypothetically, right? So I would used to make a website on, Microsoft Dreamweaver. I'm sorry, Microsoft Front Page or Adobe Dreamweaver, and then send it in an AOL chat room. Like that's how long ago this was, and let the counter go up and get feedback from it. And that's kind of what sparked the whole thing. And fast forward, finally there were roles that described, what is a front end engineer today, but also, front end engineers that really care about user experience. And that's where I ended up sitting. I ended up sitting as a UX engineer first, which was like this hybrid thing between really caring about the user experience and what the user needs are and understanding that pathway. And many people in that pathway, especially folks that go to boot camps, they do that work up until a point. And that point is, this is what the app would look like, right? That's what the product designer kind of ends up at. And that's a wall a lot of the time. And I needed to go past that wall, clearly. I wanted to actually make it work. And in order to do that, especially in the web, you need to code. So I ended up, becoming an engineer in that way, where you're kind of learning how to code and being able to actually execute on the designs that you want to, release. And that full gamut really gives you the perspective of the entire workflow, right? We're talking, what is the problem we're trying to solve, to actually solving that problem and putting it in front of users, and then completing that feedback loop to get all the way to the back where we started, and learn from what we just built and improve that. So it's so powerful to be able to go and do that loop. The architect piece that you asked about comes from doing that so many times and learning about all the mistakes along the way, and being able to anticipate where optimizations can happen, where we should pivot, and just thinking about things at a much higher level, holistic level, looking at the bigger picture overall. That's one aspect of the architecture. And another aspect of the architecture is knowing that, especially in large companies like GoDaddy, you have multiple users that you need to satisfy. In GoDaddy's case, for example, some of my users are my peers, right? They're going to be using the assets and reading the plans that we have for distribution. And then GoDaddy, of course, has its own customers that will be using these products. And then in the case of GoDaddy, those customers are building websites for their customers. So it's customers the whole way down, or users the whole way down, right? So I need to consider all of those different levels of user and what their needs are at levels of depth that many other UX folks don't have the responsibility of um, requiring to focus on that large picture, because many product designers and folks have very specific features that they're going to be focused on and understanding the user need of, and then finding solutions for. I'm taking a larger um, piece of the pie and really thinking of the entire experience, and attempting to solve for that and provide plans for that.
And I think they take us to our next questions, because yeah, you kind of brought us as like, this is all what I did to get where I am today. But what will you say that are the main responsibilities of a UX architect in a project?
Yeah, the main responsibility for me is the plan. So it needs to be an executable plan that is cohesive and concise and clear. So all the C words that people can execute on, right? So that's thinking about all the different little nooks and crannies of things, and thinking about the general overall user experience for all users coming in, all audiences that we expect to happen. So it's all about the planning. It's very much less about the actual execution, right? An architect is a much senior level role after you've done product design or engineering for some time in the user experience space. So after you've done that for many years, and again, like I mentioned earlier, just you know optimizing from all that experience that you have, you can start getting to create those plans in order for other folks to execute on and learn from, and then themselves grow into more senior levels.
Um, how do you work with the rest of the team? Because yeah, you mentioned, like, of course you have a group of designers and then a group of engineers. How do you work with all of these people in your team?
Yeah, that's, I think the big thing about that is communication and collaboration, right? So, gathering that feedback from users, like I mentioned earlier, one of my direct users that I'm working with happens to be my peers. So, getting that feedback from those peers immediately is really good. So that's one of the big parts of the job in terms of working with the team, is that collaboration, getting that feedback loop in where everyone is able to contribute ideas in a open space, in a friendly space, in an inviting space, so that no one feels like they're dumb or stupid for asking something. Any particular idea could be a valid one, or one that we actually
Mhm.
approach and take. So being able to see those ideas, because I mean, granted, like, I have ideas too, but everyone has ideas, right? Everyone can have their own experiences to contribute, and that the only real part of my job there is to take all of that information and pare it down into something that everyone can execute on, right? It's kind of
Mhm.
being like the moderator of a panel, right? If you had everyone who had ideas and discussions that they were providing into a particular conversation, you want to kind of bring all that together as one thought that represents the team as best as possible, right? Because of course there'll
Mhm.
be some areas of contention which you want to kind of smooth over, but generally speaking, you want to have that representation as one team, and this is our plan, and we would like to execute this plan because of these reasons.
And I'm touching maybe a little bit around the contentions and uh, things that may not work the best or that you're still working on. What are kind of those roadblocks that a UX architect will find in a team or a project?
Hmm. I think what happens a lot of the time is, especially with design, you'll have ego driving some decisions, and you really need to kind of pick that apart. And you really need to ask about, where's the data, where is the research that backs the decisions that you're so passionate about, right? Why do you want this to be this particular color red over the red that we've been using? What's the point of that? How is that going to help the user? What's the research behind that? Because that's just a small example, and I'm actually writing a blog post about color very soon. But but that's the kind of thing that trying to work with that, um that kind of ego. And that happens, unfortunately, also with a little bit more green designers, the younger, or the junior ones, just because they come into an industry where they want to make a difference, they want to make an impact, and
Mhm.
they end up often thinking about these really new wild ideas that they may have seen in a dribble or a behance, and they've done a little bit more exploration on that, and they really want to try that out. And I think there's a place for that, absolutely, of going on that exploration. But there's also a lot of research that exists out there about what users are expecting, and how much that drives business and flow. Because if we give users what they're expecting, they're of course much more likely to complete that task. Versus if we give them something new that they're confused about, it's much less likely that they're going to complete that task. So you have to kind of, again, taking that ego out, and taking those places where this might not be the opportunity to do that exploration, and understand, and convey why, in a, again, a respectable way, is one of the things that is part of the job, unfortunately, right? I really do want to do cool stuff, I really do, don't get me wrong, like, but the other thing about it is we have to absolutely have our users first, and really understand what their needs are versus what we want to do.
Nice. And I mean, And I think for me, what maybe is sometimes hard to understand, as maybe because I don't hear that many UX architects in a team or in a project, is like, uh, when do a product or a company or a project should be thinking about having a UX architect into the team? Should every project or team have one? How does usually work?
The answer is no. They certainly don't need a UX architect. All people do not, or all teams do not need UX architects. I think, and this happens also very often too, because I'll have recruiters that reach out to me and say, "Hey, I like your background. Would you mind, having a conversation?" And I, we have a conversation. We chat about their current setup, and I recognize right there that it's not time for them to have a person of my skill set on board, because it's either too early, or it's still trying to create that product. So um, in that particular sense, especially again in those small organizations where there isn't a lot of features, there's not a lot of products behind it, and it's just like one focus, you don't really need an architect to look at a much larger picture at that point, right? Because there's only really one or two products or features that you really need to focus on. And I think any experienced product designer would be able to handle that and have that capability very successfully. It's only when you grow to a larger scale, when you have really product teams, right? Individual
Mhm.
teams that are in charge of several different products. Um, is it about that time to consider having someone that looks at the UX as a whole and is able to provide the plan to make sure that as a user goes from the home page to login to the dashboard to the cart to the checkout, that experience is consistent as they go through there. Because again, when you start with the dashboard, that might be one product or feature team, and then the checkout is
Mhm.
another product or feature team, and it's often they don't talk to each other, right? So you really need someone to look over all of those products and features and be able to provide those plans to those folks. And as an aside, some people might confuse this with, like, a head of design or a director of design, creative
Mhm.
director or whatever. And that's not the same, because most of those folks at those levels are actually really people managers,
Mhm.
and a little bit less of the day to day user experience kind of decision making. The UX architect role is more of an individual contributor, an IC level role, right? It's again, and I'm not a manager. I just again, I'm doing the planning at the high level. So I'm the executing that I'm doing is a plan. I'm writing those plans,
Mhm.
and I do directors and other managerial types in the design org, provide feedback to that, absolutely. But it's still my responsibility for that plan. So, but again, to go back to your question, does everyone need one? Absolutely not. I think it's really just for scaled organizations that have several feature teams that really would benefit from someone that has my expertise.
Makes sense. Okay, so now knowing this, and that not every organization or company needs a UX architect, what are the benefits, the companies that they may need one and don't have one yet? So, what are the benefits that you bring into a project?
Yeah. So my benefits really are, again, thinking about that consistent experience, so that it's a person that's really looking at all levels of the user flow and the user journey as they go through that. I'm also, of course, taking accessibility and inclusion into effect there as well, to make sure that everyone has that same accessible experience, so that again, people can log in. They can, like for instance, passwords are notoriously difficult to make as an accessible experience. Just imagine, a screen reader reading out the characters aloud to your password, as you're typing. So, like, trying to juggle that kind of, experience that people aren't really thinking about, uh,
Mhm.
and making sure that we do account for it is important, right? So it's pieces like that that will be beneficial from people who are experienced in experience, to again know about the roadblocks, know about the pitfalls, know about the road bumps, and be able to avoid them and provide solutions for those things more quickly than, again, someone who's potentially just a product designer that might be doing a rabbit hole in one particular feature and missing other pieces of it on the
Mhm.
side. So, that's one of the benefits there. And like I mentioned earlier, my focus specifically at GoDaddy is the design system. So we're really thinking about how to make things composable, how to leverage design tokens in a themable way, because actually GoDaddy is a multi-brand company. We have multiple brands inside of our organization, so we have to support the design systems resources and have them themable through different brands. So that's also a very significant undertaking to support as well. So that's another piece that also comes in with localization. So, for example, at GoDaddy, many of our primary buttons are black, but the black primary button does not bode well in China. That just doesn't sit well with
Mhm.
those folks. So for China specifically, we actually changed the color of our primary buttons to a teal color. So that's a localization change that needs to be paid attention to as well. So those are a lot of the factors that once you get to a larger scale and you start thinking, more inclusion, more accessible, more localized, there's a lot more to consider, and you need experts that know about those things.
Uh, okay, so let's say there is a smaller company that still doesn't need a UX architect. How that these companies can prepare or do their best to have like a good coming up whenever is the time for a UX architect to come in?
Yeah, so I guess identifying when you should have a UX architect is really when you're getting to that scale. I think that's really what it's talking about, right? When you start identifying that you have, teams that are responsible for features, and those teams start having their own scrums or having their own PMs that are in charge of their products, and really, unfortunately, siloing a little bit. When you see that siloing happening uh, between different products, that's when you really, again, need to find someone to glue it all back together uh, to be able to execute on some plans. Additionally, like I mentioned, if there's a consideration that you might go international, that's something that might be also a good point to bring someone in that either is specific for internationalization, which will be an architect of sorts that would provide all the guidance to make something localized. Accessibility also could have technically an architect that describes how accessibility should be executed across the organization. So there's lots of different like specialized architects, for those particular pieces. But yeah, it's just, I think it ends up being a need that's identified that's larger than any one particular product, right? We're again looking at the platform level and saying we really need to get this unified. How do we do that? And an architect is going to be the person who probably helps you out with that.
So you pretty much you like mess and kind of clean it up and make it useful and clear for everybody in a way.
Yeah, it's definitely a matter of making it useful. Like what I do specifically is I'm trying to get to the bottom of the reasons why we make decisions so that other people can also make decisions in this way. Like a good example of this is um, we as designers typically will think of a primary button as a particular color of button that appears in our UI. But instead of thinking it that way, what I think people should consider it is as the button that is the most prioritized in the UI. What color that is, or what the text style is, actually doesn't matter. What matters is that we've identified that this is the most important action that the user should take on this page. So we need to identify this is the thing that the user needs to do. Not all the other stuff that's on the bottom, or edit and delete and stuff like that. That's not important for this particular this particular flow. This button, let's say it's compose, is the most important thing that they need to do, or the most common thing that they'll need to do on this page. So we need to show that this thing is a primary button. How the treatment looks for the primary button is a secondary thing that you do. It's a secondary exercise that you should partake in. So that's just like, again, one example of changing the way that we think about design from what we used to do as a graphical design kind of approach, and more very much a purposeful design approach. Why am I doing what I'm doing? really understanding why I've made this design decision versus trying to make it look good, because making it look good is actually going to be very easy. And it's actually fun to make it look good. But the harder and a lot more thoughtful thing is to make it purposeful. Why did I decide to do this? Really understand why you did that. And when you start thinking about it this way, you really start creeping into actual user experience design versus user interface design, which again is, a little bit more graphic oriented based and a lot, unfortunately, a little bit less user focused.
Makes sense. And I feel like the next question is a little bit hard because based on your experience and everything that you have done, to get to your level takes like years of experience and working with different companies and different people. But if someone would like to follow or specialize as a UX architect, what will be some of the steps that they can take today, even if these take years, like what they can start doing today?
It's a good question. Like you mentioned, it's definitely an experience thing. You're definitely going through a lot and learning a lot. I think always second guessing yourself, I think, is a really good way of breaking into it. Yeah, I think that's one of the pieces as well. Is like, um, if you don't know something, it's okay, and it's even better to do the legwork to find the answers. And I say answers because it doesn't necessarily need to be one answer. Um, there could be lots of ways of tackling a problem, and the more informed you are about that problem, the better equipped you are to know what a recommendation is going to be. And I say recommendation instead of a solve, right? Because a solve seems very permanent, but a recommendation seems a lot more fluid, right? Because that recommendation can change with new data. So I think, again, yeah, just being open to feedback, being open to new information that can change your perspective. Um, and I think that's one of the largest things, because, like I mentioned earlier, it's the more entry level designers that have this thing that they want to do, and they'll stop at nothing to do it, which is really good for the beginning learning process. That's exactly how I learned. I had things that I wanted to do, and I had directions that I wanted to go in order to do them. But at some point, you kind of already have done that already, and you've kind of, again, like I mentioned, you hit the road bumps and you've learned from that stuff already. And enough of those times, you'll gain this wealth of knowledge that you can share to other folks. And I think that's another point of it, right? Is like when you see yourself sharing that knowledge a lot, as opposed to learning, because you'll never stop learning, don't get me wrong, but when you tip that scale from learning to sharing, and where that sharing is welcomed, right? Because it's very easy to share stuff that isn't welcomed, unfortunately. But where that sharing is welcomed, I think that's where you begin to become that architect, where people are looking toward you for the plan, right? And that's the role of the UX architect, right? People are looking toward you for the plan because of all the help that you provided, all that sharing, all that resource, all that knowledge you provided. I think is where that happens. So it's not something that you're going to do overnight. I don't think it's really anything that you'll get from a boot camp necessarily. I don't think that it exists entirely. I really do think it's really, unfortunately, a matter of experience, because, again, like I mentioned too, it is a higher level, right? It's definitely a higher level individual contributor role, and that really comes with experience.
Yeah. I know that you mentioned at the beginning too that you went into engineering to know more about this, and this is what it helps you to kind of go around the flows and learn every time and optimize. Do you think that is something that a person that want to be a UX architect is something that they need to do to be better at this job?
I think I might miss the beginning of the question. You said something about
Being an
optimization.
engineer, like being like that
Engineer.
front end engineering. Yes.
I got it. So the engineering part of it is absolutely going to help, because that will allow you to speak the language to engineers, because the engineers are ultimately the folks that are executing on the final designs, right? So being able to know what's even possible and incorporating that into plan is going to be hugely beneficial. However, it's not required, right? If you are experienced enough in the product design space and have worked with engineers for a number of years and understand what their needs are and what kind of conversations are going to come up through all that experience, you can of course plan for that without actually even coding. Um, and that's a question that comes up all the time, actually, just in the product design space. The question
Mhm.
that says, should designers learn to code? And the answer from my perspective is no, they don't have to, but it certainly helps if they do. And
Mhm.
what I actually have a much stronger opinion about is that I believe designers should know about the medium that they're designing for, right? And that goes for any designer, right? If you're talking about a person who paints on canvas, they need to know the different kinds of canvases, they need to know the different
Mhm.
kinds of paints, how that stuff reacts to each other, to get the best result. It's the exact same thing. If you are a designer that works in the web, right, you should know about your medium. You should know about responsive design and what that's all about. You should know about how SEO and the HTML kind of semantics works, right? You need to know about some of these things because it will absolutely impact the success of your design. Knowing that it's going to improve it, other than you finding out about it after the fact, right? Which is something that's going to happen again for entry level designers. You're going to find out about this stuff, but the ability to be proactive about learning about that stuff is going to definitely improve the success of any one of your designs.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. So I think before we go to the last question that is about gridless design, we have some questions here on this side. So
Okay.
let me see. I don't know about it. Okay. So Luigi has a lot of questions. Thank you, Luigi, from wherever you are. So, what tools of software does a UX architect use?
Tools and software. It's usually word processing, actually, right? Because we're talking about plans, right? So we're really talking about um, ways of being able to communicate your ideas to folks. So that happens with product design. There'll be presentations and things like that for those kinds of things. But uh, yeah, I went from tools like Figma or VS Code or things like that, right? Sketch and Notepad or whatever, to do those things. But much of my work now is really writing. Like that's very
Mhm.
much my job at this point, which I'm writing about the plans, writing communicating with people, getting that feedback, finding ways of collecting that feedback and making it actionable. Um, so yeah, it's not a lot of tools. I will say from a design system standpoint, and from the engineering part of the design system standpoint, we use Storybook a lot. It is definitely one of the things to use when you're crafting a design
Mhm.
system in that particular realm. Um, but I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we use that's interesting. There's definitely a couple of other tools that are out there that I think are really cool. There's a tool called Wizard, which is Uizard. It is an offshoot of an experiment that was done at Airbnb in a research and development team. And what it does is you're able to draw a wireframe and import that wireframe into a process that spits out using your design system rules a high fidelity mock-up of what that thing would be, right? So you're no longer in this particular way making high fidelity mock-ups as long as you have design system rules and wireframe skills, which is just drawing boxes, right? So what they claim to be able to do is to put those stuff together and actually create high fidelity mock-ups, as a consistent kind of output. I think it's really cool, but I haven't
Yeah,
used one.
that sounds pretty cool. I mean,
Yeah,
and again, I think that we'll have to go back to what you were saying, have this design system really clear and how is the users of all the components for these to work like it's magic. So, but this sounds amazing.
yeah.
I feel like the next question from Josh is maybe not related with this, but yes, and I think you mentioned something about like writing, communicating your. I'm just jumping to the question, but maybe it's not. But she's asking about she's switching careers and now she wants to come into UX design. And I know that we're talking more about here UX architect, but the last question you were mentioning that you were presenting, you were writing, you were planning. So maybe there are some soft skills that we can keep growing and getting better, not just for UX design, but maybe for as a UX architect that we can keep working on. So, what are the skills that we can work on if we are switching careers?
Yeah, and I think you made actually a really good point on that as well. Is that even an entry level product designer will be doing some planning or some research or some knowledge gathering, right? That's going to happen, but it's going to happen at a more focused level, right? There's one feature or one product or even one part of the product that you are responsible for answering, right? And all the architect is a much larger scale of that, right? So you're going to get those skills at that core level. But to answer the question about the transition, many people that go through my user research program over at Parsons, which is the first part of the curriculum, um, they uh, they say that they are also transitioning between jobs. And I think the easiest thing to say about that is if you want to go into user experience, to always put the user first. That's it. And you, of course, can have your own, pain points that you've identified that are specific to you. That could inform some of these things about what directions you may want to consider taking. But ultimately, the whole thing about user experience is the user. It's not about the design. It's not about the code. It's not about any of that. It's not about how good this thing looks. It's all about, is this usable? Is this solving the user's problem? And in order to identify if it's even solving that problem, you need to know about the problem. And that's one of the hardest parts, is really identifying the real problem. So if you're able to identify problems, and of course identify users out there, and I think you're going to really get a good kickstart. I think, and I don't know this person's previous role that they're coming from, but especially folks that are in like hospitality or people who are speaking to people on a regular basis and hearing complaints, for example, are definitely great folks to um, uh, transition into the UX space, because they've heard all the pain points, and some people don't want to do anything about them, and they'll just continue being in hospitality, not liking what they're doing. Or people want to make a difference, and those are the people that go into UX. So another point, of course, is if you want to make a difference, UX is a great place to make that difference, and be motivated there. So those are the recommendations I have in terms of that transition, right?
Yeah.
You kind of need to want to have to do it.
Yeah, makes sense. And I feel like again, being conscious about these skills, like you were saying again at the beginning, is uh, if you start noticing what you do at work, like if I will talk about you and I talk about my job, maybe, yeah, of course, I don't know in that big scale, but how I can use my skills right now if I want to keep or do something like you do. I think it's just being conscious about what we do right now. Okay, let's see. So next one, Luigi have so many questions. So what methodology do you mainly use in planning as a UX architect as a in GoDaddy or at GoDaddy?
Methodology. I think I think it's the purposeful design methodology, right? Uh, really understanding the reasons why we're making decisions. I think that's what we're really talking about in terms of methodology. Unless there's something more specific about that, I don't think there probably is in the question. But that's what I would like people to really fall back on when they are in the middle of a design process, is really just thinking about why we're making these decisions. Like, why have I decided to put the primary button at the bottom versus the top, right? What's the purpose of that? Is it because it looks better? Because I don't agree with that. But is it because we want to show the user that this is something they could do right now versus something that we want them to do later once they completed everything that's on that page. So there's definitely, like, a couple of points that could be considered were just the placement of that button. And then, of course, again, full circle, after releasing that, experimenting on it and seeing what the results are, it might be a matter of, do we test it up there on top versus the bottom, and seeing what those results have, and making the best decisions from that. So that's, I guess, part of the methodology, right? Is, again, purposeful design, and also that iteration process, that full circle.
Okay, another one from Luigi. So what book would you recommend for inspiring UX architects? If there is any book there.
Oh, a book.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think there's anything out there about UX architects. I haven't actually read much in the space recently, to be honest. So I don't think I have anything offhand. I apologize.
Okay. No, that's good. I think this takes us to a good point now, that is you being an author about gridless design. And so what is this? What is this gridless design about?
Okay, so this I have a lot of hot takes in the design community, and actually one of them most recently, Dan Mall and I were kind of going a little bit of a spicy conversation about, which had to do about atomic design. But gridless design is a very hot take, which is, I think many designers are familiar with the grid when you're designing something on an interface, right? You have 12 columns, a couple of gutters. You want to have things, span those columns in different breakpoints. They'll have different columns, and so on and so forth. And what gridless design is saying is that we should be actually not using the grid in order to design our web experiences. And obviously, yeah, hot take. This
is what we learned at school.
Exactly. And what I'm saying in that is this. Kind of what I said about earlier about the artist knowing their canvas and the paint and all of this stuff. That's exactly what I mean here when it comes to gridless design. The web isn't a canvas in that way. It's not like a Photoshop canvas or Figma canvas or artboard. It doesn't work that way. A website or a web page is actually a document. That's what it was originally designed to be. It was originally designed to be a document. So you'd be writing, research papers on the internet. And eventually we started, again, kind of hacking things in order to make it look a little bit more interesting. But essentially, the web page is a document that has a document flow, right? So as you type things in a document, it'll go to the end of the line, and it'll jump to the next line, and you go across the line and go so on and so forth. So that's what the web is actually expecting. The web is expecting, these elements inside of this page to flow. And when we apply this very strict grid onto this document, we no longer get the flow of the document any longer. Now we're constricting things into these very specific columns, where instead what we could be doing is, using percentages or other, other methods to, kind of inform where things should be in its ideal state, but really recognizing that even with all the artboards that we could potentially design, we will never get all of those correct, right? Just think about translation, right? If you translate the words "buy now" that you would find on any button on the internet, if you translate that to Mongolian, those 8 characters with exclamation point, 8 characters that way, to Mongolian turns into 20 characters. Wow. So it becomes 3 times as large. And you, as a designer, are certainly, I'm almost positive, not thinking about how your button is going to be translated to Mongolian, and not knowing how that would break that experience when it gets there. But if we design in such a way that allows for that flow to be maintained, then that document, rule set that the web already has will know how to handle when things get too large, right? It'll know exactly what to do, because we aren't giving it another set of prescribed rules that it should go against in order to make this very ideal layout. And that's the core of gridless design. It's not necessarily saying that we can't have a grid-like web page, right, with the cards and stuff like that. I'm not saying that. I'm also not saying that we can't use things like CSS Grid. I'm not saying that. Those are also good things. What I am saying, though, is that all of those pink lines that are in that artboard shouldn't be the thing that you hand off to the engineer and say, I need these things to span 3 columns or 4 columns or whatever. That way of describing it to the engineer should be omitted instead of and replaced with, I just need this to take up about half of the width of the screen when it can, right?
Mhm.
I think it would look a little bit nicer that way. And allowing, again, the document to just flow. Allow content to dictate the size of the containers. Allow for the relationships between space of elements to also be maintained, and really just kind of adopt what the web is providing you at the first place, as opposed to just shoehorning, your own grid on top of it.
Will this help you for responsive design? Like now I'm thinking that that will help in that way too.
Yes, it absolutely 100% is supportive of responsive design. The thing about gridless in particular is I think it takes responsive design just one step further, because in the gridless mentality, there are no breakpoints. It's like there is no
Mhm.
spoon, right? There are no breakpoints in my view with gridless, because all it does is it does a natural flow. If you're writing a document in Microsoft Word or whatever, you don't have breakpoints in the document. It just reflows, right? When there's not
Mhm.
enough room, it just goes down. So it's the same kind of idea. If there's no room, things just flow, as opposed
Mhm.
to identifying very specifically that at this point in particular, we need to make changes. Um,
Mhm.
so I try to, in my work in terms of gridless work, I try, and it's not foolproof. There are definitely places where a breakpoint's going to have to help, just because the layout is definitely requires one, just from a realistic standpoint. But it's relying a lot less on breakpoints to define what things should be happening, and really leaning on the natural flow of the document to provide that for us up front.
If you could tell us maybe 1 to 3 tips, maybe one or two, three, I mean, up to you, that we could start taking for the grid list, what will be something that we can start doing today to start kind of bringing that into our work process?
Yeah. I think I kind of mentioned them. I'll go over 'em very specifically again, though. The first thing, and this is really important for design and engineering, of course, is allow the contents of any container to dictate its dimensions, its size, right? So don't force the size of any particular button or input or anything like that. Allow those things to be the size of their containers. Or the other option, of course, is, and I know this happens for inputs, for example, allow those inputs to just stretch the width of whatever available space that's there. Okay, so it's either one of those two things: either allow it to be the size of the content in the case of most buttons, or allow it to take up the available space that's available in the case of like input fields. So that's one piece. Um, the next piece, of course, is talking about that document flow thing, right? So instead of saying, at this point, these things shift, just allow that content to shift on its own. And there are techniques to be able to do that. I don't expect designers to know what those techniques are. I very much expect engineers to know what those techniques are. But in the conversation that you have with an engineer, that conversation should be a lot less of very strict pixel values, and more so
Mhm.
of, when there isn't enough room, I want you to do this. Okay.
Mhm.
Because that puts the onus on the engineer to interpret what that means. Okay. And if you want to, again, give some more guidance about what that means, you can, again, of course, cite gridless design, certainly, but um, remind them about document flow, I think, is really good, but never really provide a strict pixel value, because if you give them one, they're going to use it, and then things will break. And then the third thing, um, actually, I think, believe has to do with about proximity, which is space. and that the amount of space that we put between two things should represent the relationship between those two things.
Mhm.
And this goes to something else that I was exploring about space in particular, which is an entirely separate topic from gridless. But keeping that in mind, so that you're not really thinking about space as, oh, 24 pixels looks better. It's more about what is the relationship between this button and this input. Is it this? Are they related? Are they closely related,
Mhm.
or are they not so much related? So they need a little bit more space, and really identifying what space means. It goes back to the purpose thing, right? Identifying what the space actually means between two things versus this just feels better, and that's all.
Mhm. Well, I think this is it for us. Again, thank you so much, Donnie, for meeting me today and sharing about what you do as a UX architect. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. Luigi, thank you for all the questions. And do not forget to subscribe on YouTube, follow in LinkedIn so you don't miss people like Donnie. Like we have once a week guests to tell them about what they do and how we can grow in our career. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.